Most people think power is taken from them in obvious ways. They imagine betrayal, humiliation, public defeat, the loud argument where somebody finally shows their true face. But power usually leaves long before any of that. It leaves in small conversations. It leaves in soft moments. It leaves in the kind of question that sounds warm enough to disarm you before you even realize you are being measured. That is why the most dangerous questions in your life almost never sound dangerous. They sound like concern. They sound like honesty. They sound like trust. And because they sound clean, you answer them without noticing that every answer is doing more than replying. It is positioning you. Machiavelli understood something most people still miss. Human beings are not ruled only by force. They are ruled by framing, by timing, by appearance, by hidden motives, by the emotional pressure built into ordinary language. A person does not need to overpower you to weaken you. Sometimes, they only need you to say yes too quickly. Sometimes, they only need you to explain when silence would have protected you. Sometimes they only need you to confirm a version of reality that was designed for their advantage. One answer is often enough, not because the words themselves are magical, but because the answer changes the balance between two people. It tells them how easily your boundaries can be negotiated, how quickly your guilt can be activated, how available your trust really is. That is the core contradiction at the center of this entire story. People call these exchanges honesty, support, care, closeness, openness, maturity, but the label is often not the reality. What they call asking may actually be taking. What they call honesty may actually be a strike protected by virtue. What they call trust may actually be pressure for immunity. Most people never see this because they judge tone first. If the voice is soft, they assume the intent is clean. If the wording is polite, they assume the mechanism is fair. But human nature does not become innocent just because the delivery becomes gentle. That is the trap. The softness is not proof of safety. Very often, it is what makes the question effective. You are trained for this from childhood. A teacher asks, you answer. A parent asks, you answer. An authority figure asks, you comply. Over time, responding became a reflex, and reflexes are quick, but not wise. They remove the pause. They erase the moment where judgment should live. They make you available to anyone who understands how to use a question as a tool instead of as a search for truth. That training may have made you polite. It may have made you likable. It did not make you powerful. Power starts the moment you realize that not every question deserves your truth, your comfort, your explanation, your confidence, or your reassurance. There are 5 questions you must never answer automatically. The first asks you to approve what was already done. The second asks you to lower your guard before an opinion lands. The third asks you to carry consequences that were never yours. The fourth asks you to betray the route by which truth reached you. And the fifth is the master question, the one that makes the other 4 easier to use because it destroys the only thing that can protect you from all of them, the pause between the question and the answer. That pause is where perception sharpens. That pause is where power either stays with you or leaves through your mouth. This is not about becoming paranoid. A paranoid person sees manipulation everywhere. A disciplined person notices patterns and waits before responding. That difference matters. You do not need to suspect everyone. You need to stop giving everyone the same automatic access. Some people in your life are safe. Some people earn closeness through consistency over time. But safety is proven in behavior, not in the tone of a loaded question. The problem is that most people never learn to tell the difference because they keep answering before they examine the function of what they are being asked. They confuse speed with sincerity. They confuse openness with wisdom. They confuse availability with virtue. And then they wonder why they feel exhausted, guilty, overexposed, and strangely powerless in relationships where they thought they were simply being good. Think about how many times a conversation changed your position without looking dramatic from the outside. Nobody shouted. Nobody threatened you. Yet after the exchange, something felt off. You felt smaller, more cornered, more obligated, less free to object later. That feeling was not random. It was the emotional cost of answering a question whose design you did not inspect. Some people lose power in one violent collapse. Most people leak it one socially acceptable answer at a time. That is why this matters. Not because every question is a trap, but because the ones that are often arrive dressed like ordinary connection. So, as we move through these 5 questions, do not hear them as theory. Hear them as patterns that may already be running through your own life. Listen for the person who acts first and asks later. Listen for the one who wraps judgment in the language of honesty. Listen for the one who hands you their decision and leaves you holding the emotional bill. Listen for the one who avoids substance and hunts the source. Listen most carefully for the one who asks for trust in words because their actions are not strong enough to earn it in silence. Once you hear the mechanism, you cannot return to innocence. And that is a good thing, because the moment your answers stop being automatic, your power starts coming back. And once you learn to hear the hidden function beneath the friendly wording, conversations stop feeling random. You begin noticing that the real struggle is rarely about the sentence itself. It is about who gets to define the moment, who gets to set the frame, and who walks away carrying the cost. That realization alone changes how you listen from that point forward. The first question is so common that most people no longer hear it clearly. Someone moves your time, your energy, your money, your role, your name, your private information, your boundary, or your plans without asking you first. Then, after the action is already complete, they look at you and say, "You don't mind, right?" On the surface, it sounds considerate. In reality, it is retroactive permission disguised as politeness. The event is over. The decision has been made. The question is not searching for consent. It is searching for your cooperation in rewriting what just happened. If you say yes, the act is no longer framed as an overstep. It becomes a decision you supposedly accepted. This trap works because the social cost is attached to your resistance, not to their action. If you say, "Actually, I do mind," the conversation suddenly turns against you. Now you seem difficult, sensitive, petty, uncooperative. The original violation becomes less visible than your refusal to smooth it over. That is why so many people say, "It's fine," when they feel the opposite. They are not agreeing because they are comfortable. They are agreeing because the question was engineered to make disagreement feel uglier than surrender. It is one of the cleanest forms of social pressure because it arrives after the fact, when you are already being forced to choose between your truth and the appearance of harmony. You have seen the pattern. A friend tells somebody something private about you and then asks if you are upset. A family member volunteers your weekend and then asks whether that works for you. A co-worker uses your work to help themselves and then says it is not a big deal because you are a team. A partner decides something for both of you and then asks if you are okay with it, now that there is no real room to say no. None of these moments feel grand enough to count as betrayal. That is what makes them dangerous. The extraction is quiet. The emotional contrast is sharp. Their tone says calm, but the mechanism says comply. What are they actually learning when you answer yes? Not whether you are kind. They are learning your tolerance for being acted on first and consulted later. And once somebody learns that about you, they usually do not stop. Human beings expand into the space they are repeatedly given. The next overstep becomes slightly bigger. The next assumption becomes more casual. The next use of your availability comes with less hesitation. Then one day you feel disrespected and cannot explain where exactly it began. It began the first time you approved something you did not choose because saying no felt socially expensive. Every automatic answer became training data for the other person. It taught them how much of your reality could be negotiated without your participation. This question also does something even more dangerous. It creates the appearance of consent. That appearance matters because later it can be used against you. If you object tomorrow, they can point backward and say they checked with you. They can say, "You were fine." They can make your own reluctant answer sound like enthusiasm. In other words, the question does not only extract compliance in the moment, it protects them in the future. It turns your discomfort into a record that can be played back when you try to reclaim your position. That is why the phrase feels so light, but costs so much. It is not merely a request for peace. It is often a contract you were pressured to sign verbally. The deeper damage is internal. Every time you smooth over what violated you, you teach yourself to distrust your own discomfort. You start calling your first reaction unreasonable. You begin to treat self-erasure as maturity. A lot of people do this for years and call it being easygoing. But not everyone who remains calm is strong. Sometimes they are simply afraid of the immediate social friction that honesty would create. That is one of the hardest truths to admit. Restraint and self-respect are not always the same. Silence can be wisdom, but silence can also be fear wearing the costume of virtue. So what do you do instead? Not something theatrical, not something explosive. You simply restore the correct frame. If the action already happened, name the sequence honestly. I would have preferred if you asked me first. That should have been discussed before it was decided. I'm not agreeing to it just because it already happened. These responses matter because they separate your calm from your compliance. They return permission to where it should have existed in time. They remind the other person that your stability does not equal surrender, and that is the real act of power. Not the perfect line, but the refusal to let an after-the-fact question turn your silence into consent. When you start doing this, people notice quickly. Not because you become aggressive, but because your yes is no longer assumed. Some will immediately adjust and begin consulting you before moving. Others will resist, and that resistance tells you something useful. It tells you that what they valued was not your comfort, but your availability. That distinction matters. Many relationships look warm only because one person is always absorbing the cost of the other person's convenience. The warmth disappears. The moment structure appears. That is how you learn what kind of bond you were really inside. That is why this question is so profitable for people who live by small encroachments. They do not need one giant victory. They only need repeated tiny approvals. Over time, those approvals change the atmosphere around you. People stop seeing your limits as real because you keep softening them after they have already been crossed. What looked like flexibility becomes permission, and permission, once normalized, rarely shrinks. It widens until your discomfort feels irrational somehow. The first question steals consent after the fact. The second one is more elegant. It arrives before the strike, not after the violation. And because of that timing, many people welcome it without even realizing they are opening the door. The second question sounds noble. That is why it lands so easily. Someone looks at you and says, "Can I be honest with you?" Most people answer yes, before they have even thought about why. Of course they do. Honesty sounds virtuous. Refusing honesty makes you seem weak, insecure, dishonest, or unable to face the truth. The frame is already built before any actual content appears. That is what makes the question powerful. It does not ask for permission to tell the truth. It asks for moral protection before delivering an opinion that may cut, destabilize, or diminish you. Think about what usually follows that sentence. It is rarely a loving observation that strengthens your clarity. More often, it is criticism disguised as courage, doubt introduced as maturity, personal judgment protected by the prestige of honesty. "I don't think you're ready. You've changed. I'm not sure this is going to work. You're not seeing yourself clearly." Once you agreed to hear it. Under the label of honesty, objecting becomes difficult. If you push back, you look sensitive. If you feel wounded, they claim they were only trying to help. If you question their motive, you become the person who cannot handle truth. Their preamble becomes armor, and your openness becomes the thing used against you. That is why the word honest can become a weapon. Not because truth is bad, but because labels alter perception before evidence arrives. A strategic person understands that if they announce honesty first, your defenses soften. You prepare to receive something morally serious, not something psychologically framed. You stop asking what they want from the conversation and start asking whether you are strong enough to receive it. That shift is the extraction. Your desire to be mature as access. Hidden motives travel best under respectable names, because respectable names lower resistance. Notice the difference between real honesty and ceremonial honesty. Real honesty usually carries responsibility. It is clear. It is grounded. It does not need a dramatic runway. A person who genuinely cares about your growth can say something difficult without turning their own boldness into the center of the exchange. But the person who begins with, "Can I be honest with you?" often needs the permission ritual, because they know what comes next will not feel like care if it arrives naked. The preamble is not there to help truth. It is there to protect the speaker from consequences. It makes their perspective feel morally elevated before you have had a chance to evaluate it on its actual quality. This is where the story deepens. Answering a question gives away your power not only through what you reveal, but through what you allow to become the frame. If you answer yes here, you often hand over your right to evaluate the message independently. You let their opinion enter your mind under the banner of truth, and once it is inside, it becomes harder to challenge. Many people carry other people's judgments for years because those judgments were delivered in the voice of honesty. The result is an ugly form of internal conflict. You begin doubting your perception while also resenting the person who planted the doubt. You cannot tell whether you became wiser or merely more insecure. That is not growth. That is contamination, dressed as candor. There is another reason this question works so well. It flatters the speaker while burdening the listener. The speaker gets to feel brave, direct, and morally superior. The listener gets to carry uncertainty. That pattern appears everywhere. Some people call themselves brutally honest when the brutality is the point and the honesty is only the excuse. Some call themselves direct when they are simply careless with the emotional cost of their words. That observation creates tension because it offends many people's self-image. But it is still true. When truth is used to create clarity, it sharpens your view. When honesty is used to create dependence, it fogs it. So what do you do instead of automatically saying yes? You refuse the moral hypnosis of the preamble. Depends on what you mean. You can say it, and I'll decide what I do with it. If it's useful, say it clearly. Those responses do something subtle but important. They keep your evaluative mind awake. They separate the content from the label. They remind both of you that what follows is still open to judgment. You are not rejecting reality. You are refusing to let the word honest decide the value of what is coming. That is how you protect your frame without becoming hostile. And the reaction tells you a lot. Secure people usually continue without much drama. Strategic people hesitate. They soften. They backtrack. They lose momentum because the shield did not attach. Suddenly, their statement has to stand on its own quality instead of on the borrowed virtue of honesty. The discomfort you see in that moment is useful information. It reveals whether the question was about truth or about positioning. That is why the pause matters. The pause is not just silence, it is inspection. The third question is even more seductive because it makes you feel respected before it puts weight on you. It does not lower your guard for a strike. It recruits your judgment so that someone else can feel less alone inside their own uncertainty. When someone asks, "What would you do if you were me?" it often sounds flattering. Your judgment matters. Your calm is wanted. Your clarity is being trusted. That emotional reward is precisely what makes the trap hard to see. Responsibility transfer rarely begins with pressure. It begins with importance. On the surface, you are simply helping. Underneath, you are being invited to stand next to a future you do not control. If your guidance leads to a good result, the person keeps the outcome. If it goes badly, your fingerprints remain. Even when blame is never spoken, it is often felt. And the emotional weight of that feeling can live in you for a long time. The third question deserves more attention because it is one of the most flattering traps in ordinary life. Someone explains a difficult situation, a breakup, a job choice, a move, a risk, a confrontation, a confession, a crossroads they claim they cannot navigate alone. Then they ask, "What would you do if you were me?" Most people hear respect in that question. They hear trust. They hear the compliment hidden inside it. You are the clear one. You are the grounded one. You are the person they turn to when something matters. That is why answering feels good at first. You are not being attacked. You are being elevated. But the emotional reward is exactly what hides the mechanism. What is the mechanism? They have a decision with consequences attached to it. They have uncertainty they do not want to carry alone. By pulling you into the choice, they reduce the loneliness of that responsibility and spread the psychological risk across two people. If the decision works, they made it. If it fails, your role becomes more visible. You told me. You said this was the right move. Even when those words are not spoken aloud, the weight still lands. You begin paying an emotional cost for a future you never had control over. That is the trap. You inherit consequence without ownership, and you do it voluntarily because being asked felt like respect. Some people who ask this are genuinely confused. Some are afraid. Some already know what they want to do and simply want another person's name emotionally attached to the outcome in case it collapses. Different motives, same dynamic. They are not only seeking clarity, they are often seeking insulation. Human beings hate owning uncertainty alone. They want company and risk. They want to feel that if the decision fails, they were not the only one touching it. That does not always mean manipulation. But even when the motive is fear, the transfer is real. Good intention does not erase a bad structure. This is why so many thoughtful people end up drained by relationships that appear harmless on the surface. They are not only listening, they are carrying borrowed futures. Their mental space fills with decisions that are not theirs. Then, when things go badly, they are left with second-guessing, guilt, resentment, and the quiet need to defend their identity as someone whose judgment should have worked. That is where ego enters. Once your answer becomes tied to your self-image, the burden becomes heavier. Now you are not just helping, you are protecting the idea of yourself as wise. The stronger move is often the opposite of what people expect. It is not to answer for them, but to return ownership to them. What are you leaning toward? What part of this do you already know? What are you afraid will happen if you choose what you actually want? These are better responses because they support clarity without donating authorship. You help them hear themselves. You do not become the author of a future you cannot supervise. That is not emotional distance. It is disciplined compassion. You can care deeply without placing your name on somebody else's consequence. There is a hard truth here that many people resist. Being asked does not always mean being valued. Sometimes being asked means being recruited into someone else's fear. That idea bothers people because it breaks a flattering illusion. We like to think our involvement proves our importance. Often it only proves our availability. And once people learn that you will carry their uncertainty for them, they come back. Not because you solved the problem, but because you softened the loneliness of responsibility. They call that support. Often, it is only access to your steadiness. The fourth question is darker because it does not ask you to carry uncertainty. It asks you to betray the route by which truth reached you. It usually appears in the exact moment you think you are finally confronting the real issue. You bring up something someone did, a lie, a contradiction, a move behind your back, a fact that exposes them. Instead of addressing the substance, they ask, "Who told you that?" In one sentence, the center of the conversation shifts. Suddenly, the issue is no longer what they did. The issue becomes your source. The redirect is so fast that most people do not notice what was just stolen. What was stolen was the frame. This question is dangerous because it does not seek truth. It seeks the channel through which truth traveled. The hidden motive is not understanding. It is control. If you answer, you stop pressing the original issue, and you give the other person a target. Now they can discredit, punish, isolate, charm, or cut off the person who exposed them. Then the system closes. You go blind again. The next truth never reaches you because the last route was burned by your answer. A lot of people do this because they feel moral pressure. They think transparency proves clean motives. But morality without perception becomes naivety. Protecting the source is often part of protecting the truth. This is one of the deepest patterns in human nature. People who fear exposure do not only defend themselves against facts, they defend themselves against the circulation of facts. They do not just want innocence, they want information control. That is why source hunters are so revealing. A person genuinely interested in what is true does not urgently need the name before dealing with the substance. The person obsessed with the source is often obsessed with shutting down the line through which reality became visible. So what do? You restore direction. The issue is whether it happened. How I learned it is not the point. We're talking about the action, not the source. Those responses matter because they protect the witness and expose the asker's real priority. If they keep pressing for the name, the mask falls faster. Their concern was never accountability, it was containment. And now, the pattern becomes clearer. The first question steals consent. The second steals your evaluative independence. The third steals your emotional position by loading you with borrowed consequence. The fourth steals loyalty and access to truth. Each works differently, but all of them rely on the same condition: you answering before examining function. That means there has to be a root question, one that weakens the pause itself. One that makes all the others easier to use. There is. It is the most familiar question of all. It is also the most dangerous. The fifth question is dangerous, not because it sounds hostile, but because refusing it feels cruel. Someone looks at you and says, "You trust me," right? Almost every pressure point in that sentence is emotional rather than logical. If you say no, you feel accusatory. If you hesitate, you feel cold. If you answer carefully, you look distant. The question corners you before anything else even happens. And because most people would rather preserve harmony than preserve clarity, they answer yes. That yes feels small in the moment. It is not small. It is a blank check. This is the master question because it changes the moral frame of every interaction that follows. Once you have declared trust, every later discomfort can be turned against you. If they act without asking, your objection now sounds inconsistent. If they speak under the banner of honesty and wound you, your reaction sounds fragile. If they ask for guidance and later shift the weight onto you, your resistance sounds unsupportive. If they demand the source after being confronted, your refusal sounds disloyal. One verbal declaration becomes leverage against every future act of perception. That is why answering this question gives away your power at the deepest level. It does not only reveal something about you, it limits your right to keep watching. This is where the contradiction becomes painful. People think trust is proven by saying it. Often trust is damaged that way. Real trust is built through repeated behavior until words become unnecessary. The people who have genuinely earned it usually do not need to ask for it in a loaded moment. Their consistency speaks quietly enough. So when somebody urgently needs the declaration, you have to ask what the words are doing for them that their actions could not. That is where hidden motives begin to show themselves. Maybe they are anxious, maybe they are manipulative, maybe they know their future behavior will not survive scrutiny unless your loyalty is recruited first. Different motives, same result. The question pressures you to trade observation for reassurance. This is where many people feel the strongest internal resistance, because they want to believe trust means softness. They want to believe carefulness ruins intimacy. They want to believe questioning is betrayal. But no relationship becomes strong because one person stops paying attention. It becomes strong because reality can survive attention. If careful observation threatens a bond, then the bond may have been living on borrowed certainty. That statement cuts because it challenges one of the most flattering lies people tell themselves, that trust means no longer needing to verify what reality is showing you. It does not. That is not trust. That is surrender. That is why this fifth question is the root. Why did you accept the retroactive permission in the first question? Because you had already committed to trust. Why did you lower your defenses when honesty was announced? Because you had already committed to trust. Why did you carry somebody else's decision? Because trust made refusal feel mean. Why did you nearly expose the source? Because trust made protection feel like betrayal. The first four are arms. This one is the heart. Kill the heart, and the arms lose power. Stop declaring trust on demand, and the other traps become much easier to see and much harder to activate. So, how do you answer? You remove the false binary. You do not rush to say yes, and you do not need to throw a cold no across the table. You answer in a way that keeps reality alive. I pay attention to what people do. Trust grows from actions. I let consistency answer that. These lines matter because they preserve the pause. They do not hand over the verbal declaration that a manipulative person can later use as a shield. And the reaction they produce is valuable. A secure person usually respects them. A strategic person often presses harder. That pressure tells you everything. It means the words mattered to them more than the truth. Now the 5 questions can be seen as one system rather than 5 isolated incidents. You don't mind, right? Asks you to validate what already happened. Can I be honest with you? Asks you to lower your guard before a hit. What would you do if you were me? Asks you to carry consequences you do not control. Who told you that? Asks you to expose the route by which truth reached you. You trust me, right? Asks you to disarm the very pause that could protect you from all 4. This is not random conversation. It is a map of access points into your boundaries, your perception, your guilt, your loyalty, and your judgment. That is why the final lesson is not about clever replies. Clever people still get manipulated. Fast talkers still surrender the frame. The point is not verbal performance. The point is disciplined perception. Once you understand what a question is trying to take, even an imperfect answer can protect you. Without that understanding, even a polished answer can still give away your power. So the next time one of these questions appears, do not rush to prove that you are kind, honest, supportive, loyal, or trusting. Those identities are exactly what these questions often exploit. Let the pause exist. Let your perception stay in the room. Let actions remain louder than labels. Give people only what the moment has earned, not what the tone is trying to pressure out of you. That is not cruelty. It is structure, and structure is what keeps power from being slowly negotiated away under the disguise of ordinary conversation. Most people will go on answering everything that comes their knee because they were trained to confuse response with virtue. They will keep leaking consent, confidence, responsibility, loyalty, and trust while calling themselves good. Then they will wonder why they feel read by everyone and understood by no one. You do not have to live that way. Not if you guard the pause. Not if you remember that every question carries a function, not just a tone. Not if you understand that power does not only live in what you say, it also lives in what you refuse to hand over. That is when people stop steering you with soft questions. That is when your power stops leaving through your mouth